Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. Despite her projections, Hermione took longer than 2 weeks to complete the defensive line in the blood wards that border the Riverlands. She initially began at Harrenhal, collecting the various and plentiful chunks of stone that littered the landscape. Some pieces were small, no longer than the size of her fist, and others were larger than the dragon she. Harry and Ron escaped on from Gringotts. With Transfiguration being one of Hermione's favorite classes, the idea behind creating watchtowers from the remains of Harrenhal seemed practical and easy at first. Then, upon seeing the massive remnants of the fortress, Hermione felt the daunting process begin to press down on her. "So, what's first?" asked Torrin, one of her guards for that morning. He, along with his brother Eddard, Darren, Daisy, her mother Mage, and a ragtag group of various volunteers from the other houses, predominantly being Bolton, Karstark, Umber, or Manderley, had fanned out, looking in various directions to ensure that Vargo Hoat's sellswords were no longer lingering in the area, especially after screaming about wanting Hermione dead. "Well," began Hermione, biting her lip. "Transfiguration law states that it is easier to transfigure one thing into something else, as long as the state it was originally in had something in common to what it would be converted into." "Which is what you're doing," broke in Eddard loudly, tossing the words over his shoulder. Despite being several feet away and facing south, he was clearly paying attention to the conversation. Perhaps this is novel for him, thought Hermione with an eye roll. She was so used to Torrin just going along with what she said, having seen her magic in action, that she was unused to others needing clarification. "Yes, Eddard, that is what I am going to do," she answered with a sigh. "The watchtowers will be made out of the same stone that made Harrenhal. I'm just going to transfigure its shape, reworking it at its molecular level to reshape it without actually changing the properties. In essence, I'm rather charming the stone for aesthetic purposes. But by using transfiguration, the alterations will be permanent since I'm not actually deconstructing the base elements that make up the stone." Eddard blinked slowly at her. Hermione's sigh was much louder. "There's literally an equation I need to follow. It's maths. Don't worry about it." "What's the first step?" asked Torrin instead. "Collecting the stones," answered Hermione primly. "Which means I'm just going to shrink everything down for the next few days, and then distribute them to the locations we plotted on the map back at Riverrun." She looked around at the men and offered a grimace. "This is going to be a very long and boring time for you." She wasn't wrong. It took her the better part of 2 weeks just to collect the largest of the stones and shrink them down to place in a separate bag with an undetectable expansion charm on it, as she certainly wasn't willing to clog up her beaded bag. Without Harrenhal to dominate or focus as a feature point for the God's Eye Lake, the gently rolling hills were far more picturesque, and Hermione could actually see the hazy, mirage-like gray smudge that was Maidenpool to the southeast and the salt pans to the northeast. The watchtower she would create in Harrenhal's place wouldn't be a towering monstrosity as the old Wind Fortress had been, yet any contemporary watchtower she could design in her mind instantly brought images of airport control towers or American prisons. Inspiration hit, and with a grin, Hermione directed her wand aloft, parallel to the ground, and in preparation for the hard flicks and jabs transfiguration required. She closed her eyes, focusing firmly on the image she wanted in her mind. From base to tower top, Hermione held the image, and then began to push her magic outward, through her wand, and towards the largest remaining rocks. The gray stone shook, a slow rumble that had loose pieces break off, and the men around her to stop what they were doing, to watch wide-eyed. Then the heaviest of the stones began slowly to rise in the air, its lumpy shape beginning to smooth and bubble into a new shape. Sweat beaded on Hermione's brow, but she kept her eyes closed and her lips pressed tightly shut, her grip on her wand white-knuckled. The stone reshaped itself, elongating, stretching, and firming into a square tower, which she placed with a jab towards the ground. The stone slammed into the earth with a heavy, dull thud that Hermione felt reverberate in her bones. She locked her knees to remain upright and opened her eyes. In front of her was a tall, square tower. It was not nearly as large as the original Harrenhal towers, but a tall, kind of sleek, with thin windows in spaced intervals. Its top was divided from the body, with 2 windows facing the witch and a lowered open-gabled roof. Eddard was looking at it dubiously. "We're using that as a tower." "Shut up," she muttered, and pointed her wand at the next largest rock. She repeated the process 3 times in total after the first tower, creating them identical in height and design. 2 were pressed closer together in distance, while the other 2 mirrored them in a long and narrow rectangular. Despite the sweat that beaded at her temples and dampened her hair at the nape of her neck, Hermione continued to work on the design she had in mind. 4 other rocks lengthened and smoothed to create curtain walls that connected the 4 towers to create an inner courtyard. Between the 2 towers in front of them, Hermione raised the height of the wall and then created an arched opening. The opening itself wasn't too large, just enough for 2 carts to pass side by side in a tight pinch. Nor was it high. In fact, she left enough room between the top of the arch and the top of the wall between the towers to add more arrow slits. While medieval enough in design that it could pass for something architecturally similar to other castles and keeps in Westeros, the gatehouse, watchtowers, arched windows, and portcullis, as well as the seamlessly integrated smooth gray stone, gave it a novelty. 2 sets of the portcullis, similar to kissing gates, where those entering would have to wait for the first gate to be lowered before the second interior would raise, and appropriately the opposite on the other end to exit, framed the gatehouses on either end of the fort. It was simplistic with its 4 towers, but the inner courtyard's narrow passage created a bottleneck point for any invading forces if they managed to enter the gate. The thickness of the curtain wall and gatehouses on either side of the fort had windows and balconies facing inward for soldiers to keep an eye on those passing below, or defend from above with their bows. For all purposes, it was similar enough to a square keep castle, but without the interior keep. The wall here was meant to usher people through, not collect and contain people and buildings. Hermione would later add stables, bedchambers, a kitchen, a mess hall, and offices within the walls of the fort and towers, but after she finished the other watchtowers, panting through her open mouth. Hermione let herself slump a bit as she dropped her wand arm. She was awake and standing, which was an improvement over her previous spellcasting in the past, but she was shaky and had the beginning of a headache. Eddard walked up the edge of the fort, running his hand down the stone. Unlike Riverrun or other stone-built castles in Westeros, the fort Hermione designed locked the stones together by fusing them with magic into one solid piece of stone, like a large quarry cut of granite. The Robb Stark tilted his head back and let out a long, low whistle of awe. "Are they all gonna look like this?" Hermione nodded her head slowly. "I think so. I like this design. I saw pictures of the Germanic limes made by the Romans and borrowed the idea. Since the limes was a border defense of over 900 forts and auxiliary towers spanning a large distance, quite like what we're doing here, I thought it was appropriate." Maggie turned her sharp eyes toward Hermione. The woman's thick, wiry, graying hair, ruddy cheeks, and round face gave Hermione the impression that Maggie Mormont could be a family member of Pomona Sprout, the head of Hufflepuff, who shared similar physical qualities, but when she looked at Hermione like that, Hermione shivered. The House of Badgers was known for their loyalty and hard work. Never did she feel so stripped when they looked at her as Maggie Mormont was. She and her daughter had the piercing eyes perfected. "So, there is something similar in your world?" Hermione nodded slowly. "Was?" "Whissies." Maggie's cool tone dropped a few degrees further. "Time happens, civilizations come and go," replied Hermione, her answers glib, but truthfully, technology in my world advanced away from swords and shields. We have other ways to protect borders, and most of them are invasive. She finished silently. But how could someone explain cameras on every street corner or privacy laws? The most Westeros had was someone reading their mail, but a clever encryption could stop that. Maggie hummed in response, turning back to face the new structure. She, along with Eddard and Daisy and 1 or 2 of the other soldiers, decided to walk the interior, seeing if it was a sound from the inside as the exterior, leaving Hermione to recuperate. She sat on a free boulder, tipping her head back to relax in the noon sun as it weakly filtered through thin, wispy clouds. "You need to eat," chided Torrin as he sat next to her, handing a small bowl filled with porridge of some kind. "I know the portkey will take us back to Riverrun, but the king will have my head if he thinks you're neglecting your health." "You're just a mother hen, Torrin," grinned Hermione. But she took the bowl and began to hurriedly scoop the goop onto a spoon, and then her mouth, even after a few bites, she felt her shakes subside and her energy return. By the time she was done the small meal, the others returned from inspecting the new fort. Meg spoke to her first. It's well made from something magically constructed. Thank you. The rest will be identical, she confirmed again. Hermione nodded. Then I see no problem with the plan, she said decisively, her tone authoritative. The others asked me here to watch and report back, and I can do so now with confidence. Hermione did her best not to roll her eyes. She could be Merlin reincarnated into Westeros, for all that mattered, and there would be those who still questioned her abilities or motives. Instead, she stood from the boulder, wiping her hands on the front of her jeans, and said, "Well, we're done here for today. No one decided whose blood would be used for this fort, since the Wen line is all but gone. Let's return and we'll move on to Goodbrook tomorrow, heading westerly since that borders the Westerlands and the Lannisters." There were noises of agreement, with Torrhen offering their portkey back to Riverrun, a Karstark shield for everyone to touch. They were then whisked away, back to their headquarters. Hermione would end up with Torrhen, practicing their combat, while Daisy met with Arya, and then they would be in meetings with Robb and the other lords, while Mage reported back on Hermione's success of the day. Rinse and repeat for tomorrow. And it was such for the following 3 weeks, as Hermione and the same group moved slowly along the western border of the Riverlands. What initially took a solid 5 hours of spellcasting in the morning, Hermione managed to improve down to 3 by the time they reached the 8th Fort Malisters a few weeks later. They had one more to do north of them, Arrynford, before returning to Harrenhal's original site, and to being moving easterly. The Malister seat, Seagard, was quite beautiful. The area wasn't necessarily rocky or mountainous or peppered with gently rolling hills. Instead, a massive castle branched out across several jutting islands, supported by large bridges. There was height to the castle, overlooking a bustling seat now nestled along Iron Man's Bay. The castle was protected by the woodsy Cape of Eagles to the north, and after speaking to Lord Jason Mallister about it, what would be their fort further down. The entire Seagard town would be bracketed by the two structures, and after further discussion, Hermione suggested adding an underground passage between the two, despite it adding several days onto their projected timeline. The problem with the busy port was that there was no way to timely process the coming and going of people, especially foreigners, and documents them all with the current Westerosi standards. Placing the Mallister fort towards the south of the town encouraged anyone leaving on foot to travel through the fort, but Seagard was still vulnerable to a sea attack. It was something she hadn't foreseen when initially planning the defense line, and it was leaving her scratching her head. Eventually, with some discussion via her mirror, Jason Mallister agreed to return to Seagard with her to be there in person, leaving his son Patrick behind to represent him at Robb's court. An apparition jumped back later. Jason Mallister was heaving his lunch in a manner more befitting a new sailor who hadn't gained his sea legs yet. "It'll pass," said Hermione sympathetically. He recovered moments later, despite a pale face, and stood to his full height as regally as he could, like none of the group had seen him vomiting a mere minute ago. "It's highly unpleasant," he said in response, but then quickly took stock of the new fort Hermione erected south of Seagard, his eyes spanning the port and then resting on his home. They had the element of some height by being further away. But several curious Mallister guards, who came to investigate after small folk reported a structure being built, were also watching them. "My lord," one called in greeting, startled by the loud pop Hermione and Mallister's arrival made. His eyes were wide, but he recovered and bowed to his liege. What is this?" Mallister waved a hand. "Further protections for Seagard, Bryn," said Mallister. "The Lady Hermione and I are discussing how to protect the port without destroying our trade." Bryn the soldier cast a wary glance towards Hermione, but nodded. "Yes, my lord." Hermione and Mallister then turned back towards the port, Hermione twirling a piece of hair around a finger, thoughtfully, the other wrapped around her stomach. Beside her, Mallister was frowning. "I can really only see one option." "Oh?" "Build a seawall," he said with a sigh. "But that will limit what ships come in and what goes out when. It also busies up the docks, and using the name collection to allow passage would take hours if not days." "What if it was further out?" asked Hermione, eyes cast further out to the mouth of the bay. "Spanning across, say, those 2 points," she pointed at a protruding cliff face from the Cape of Eagles, and then swept her arm southward to near them, where in the distance she could see another small inlet and grassy beach dunes. "We can move the fort to that end instead, by the dunes. We'll build a seawall, or tidal wall, I suppose, to span a portion of Iron Man's Bay instead. It'll be more work, and I'd want to embed the stone deep into the seafloor, but we can make the gates large enough for ships to pass through. One gate in, one gate out. You won't use the names the same way here, but we can devise a different plan to close the gates with the ward. Mollister nodded thoughtfully. Yes, that might work. The fort would be closer to the mountains and Lord Blackwood's fort. It would make it easier to connect the two. He turned to face her, looking down with curious eyes. How long would it take? Hermione sighed, definitely more than today. Meg is reported back with the parchments, their snag in planning, and then Hermione said a mental goodbye to a relaxed afternoon, as much as one could relax while sparring with Torrhen Karstark, and shucked her jacket despite the much colder weather further north. Concentrating, she undid the transfiguration on the completed fort. Each tower at the four corners melted down back into the original boulder from Harrenhal, until only they and a series of smaller stones that made up each of the walls of the fort remained. Eddard and Darren helpfully went to collect the smaller stones to fetch for her, while Hermione shrank the boulders and axe-showed them right into her fort bag. Incredible, breathed Mollister, eyes wide. You think that was something? Muttered Torrhen, cutting his eyes towards the man. Watch her put the damn thing up. Despite feeling the drain on her magic, Hermione did just so. The spot they had chosen to overlook Seagard meant that she could see the dunes to the south just as easily, and sending the stones Eddard and Darren were collecting there was easy to do. The boulders would take a bit more time, from unshrinking them and then placing them and then transfiguring them, but the wait was worth it. Hermione broke her best time of 3 hours by shaving off 30 minutes and putting the fort back up. But she made changes, turning one of the towers into a lighthouse with an open brazier at the top. The actual tide wall and tunnel, which Mollister still wanted, would take longer. 3 days later, and very behind schedule, Seagard had a new tidal wall that spanned a portion of Iron Man's Bay, and only Mollister's chosen household staff knew of the tunnel that linked Seagard with what they were calling the Eagle's Nest. The tying of the blood to the ward was simple. A few drops of Mollister's blood, ensuring his bloodline was tied to the fort, and Hermione leading him through the Latin-based spell in the Black Family Library book she had borrowed before her return to Hogwarts. There was a sizzle as the blood heated on the ward stone located underground and inside the fort, and then on a Gemino copy of a master map of the Riverlands that Robb had in his war room, Eagle's Nest appeared. Hermione had taken the idea of the Marauders map and fashioned her own version for the ward. It didn't monitor every single person within the border, the way the map did, but it did show the watchtowers as they turned on. So far, the entire western border of the Riverlands and the bottom southern half on the western side was lit with a silver line connecting them, the ward already in place. Wishing to regain some of their lost time, Hermione had everyone portkey back to Harrenhal to begin their eastern leg of the defensive line that evening, after she pushed forward and finished Erenford just after the evening meal. Back in the south, where the air was considerably warmer, Darren and Eddard made camp, while several others set a patrol. Daisy was going through a series of moves with her blades, keeping her skills, while a group of the Umber soldiers watched, calling out at her and trying to make her break her concentration, and of course failing. Hermione sat propped up against a remaining wall of Harrenhal's similar to the one she, Torrhen, and Daisy had crept along when they rescued Brienne and recaptured Jaime Lannister. Torrhen sat on the wall, using a whetstone to sharpen his blade calmly, and Meg sat across from her, the fire between them. Lady Mormont, said Hermione, drawing her attention, if I can ask, you don't ever seem to question my magic. Why is that? The peoples of Westeros have their own kind of magic, Lady Hermione, answered the older woman with a wry look on her face. The first men who came to Westeros thousands of years ago had a touch of magic in their green seers, wargs, and grumpkins. Your kind of magic is just a different branch of the tree. If magic is that common in Westeros, why aren't more aware of what I can do? Asked Hermione. Confusion in her tone. Everyone acts like I'm a novelty. Torrhen snorted from Hermione's side. You are a novelty. Before she could open her mouth and ask how or why, Torrhen continued. Magic the likes of which you do with your wand is unknown or unheard of by us in Westeros. Or, I'd imagine, elsewhere. Meg was nodding. Magic by blood, yes. Magic by wand, no. What kind of magic by blood exists here then? Asked Hermione curiously, drawing her knees up to loop her arms around them comfortably as she rested her cheek on her bony knee. Bad kinds, said Magda darkly. Human sacrifices, the absolute control of creatures, slavery, and death. Hermione shivered. She licked her lips nervously and muttered, "I'm not like that." "Of course you aren't," replied Torrhen, indignant on her behalf. "Others think so," pointed out Meg, in a tone as if she was describing the night as dark. It was dry and pointed. "Like who?" demanded Torrhen. "Lady Stark," muttered Hermione lowly. "I know she doesn't like me, and Lord Glover, Blackwalder, and I dislike each other." Magus laughed loudly. "Well, that's more to do with your—" She paused, thinking of the right word. "Friendship with the King Witch." Her laughter drew the attention of others, and slowly the fire gained more attendants, other than the patrol, who kept their eyes on the darkness around them. The older woman sighed and poked at the fire with a stick, making it pop. As for Lady Stark, the woman glanced away before speaking. "She has her reasons to mistrust anything odd, Lady Hermione. She's a southern woman, and southern folk don't know what it's like to grow up in the north." "But she's lived in the north for years," countered Hermione in confusion. "She married into it and bore several children that she raised northern. That should be long enough to absorb the culture and traditions." Magus shrugged. "Can be. But southern ways are rightly strange, with their worship and the lack of their belief of anything other than their 7 gods." Hermione sighed. "Like magic." "Like wards," countered Mage, her eyes glittering from across the fire as they bore into Hermione's, "like grumpkins, wards, and woods witches and things beyond the wall." A chilly breeze pushed by them, and the fire flickered, drawing the attention of everyone sitting around the camp. Silence descended, and someone, one of the Umbers, uttered a swear under their breath that was half prayer. Unconsciously, Hermione found herself inching towards the comfort of Torrhen's presence. When she was 11, the idea of magic to a Muggle-born was amazing as everything and anything she had read in a fantasy novel and Hogwarts delivered. However, as she got older, she saw much more of the darkness in the wizarding world, from necromancy to Horcruxes and racial prejudice and slavery, but the magic in Westeros was something she was not familiar with or prepared for. She stumbled over the unfamiliar name, a burning jealousy of not knowing something burning through her. What are Grumpkins? And Wargs? Eddard, who grinned at Hermione as he sat with a heavy thump on the hardened earth at Torrhen's feet, still carefully away from the blade. Grumpkins are mythical creatures that grant wishes. Darren, who had been setting up camp with Eddard, sighed and shook his head, turning to face Hermione, and explained in further detail. They grant wishes by either crafting magical objects, which make wishes come true, or by directly giving people a number of wishes. Legend states that the 3rd wish is the last, and must be used carefully. Hermione's eyes went wide. "Like a genie." "Are your genies small and short in stature and steal children too?" grinned Eddard, baring his teeth and enjoying the startled look on Hermione's face as he antagonized her. No," responded the disturbed Hermione. "Not quite like a genie, then." "Where do the similarities and differences between our worlds meet and end?" "And wargs?" she asked instead before the silence became too awkward. "Skin changers," said Maggie's, "folk who can turn into animals." "Oh, we have that too," she said, grateful that this one wasn't nearly as bad as the others. "We call them animagus, people who turn into their animal form." Darren shook his head, his hair flopping a bit as he did so. "No, Lady Hermione, wargs can turn into any animal, so the legends say, but I think it's more that they bond with an animal and they share a mind." "A shared consciousness," murmured Hermione, thinking back to when Robb became angry with his men and Grey Wind's terrifying howl that burst through the night. At the strange liquid-like sensation, the king's eyes turned as his emotions grew in strength. Small, low conversations broke through the group as people eased off into pairs or tasks, leaving Torrhen to finish his task and Hermione to herself. She found herself staring off into the distance, south, towards King's Landing as her thoughts turned. Does Catelyn see me as a threat, then? Because she doesn't know what I'm capable of, and because I've defied her or Robb in the past, she wondered with a frown. Surely she knows I'd rather Crucio myself than harm a Stark. They're my friends. My abilities are nothing compared to the rumors and stories of the North and the magic of the First Men. Their abilities and strengths are so different to mine. Her fingers itched to pull out her mirror and speak to her friend, to hear Robb's voice and discuss this revelation and see if he agreed or not, but instead, she was torn from her thoughts by something else. The southern horizon was awash with a green tinge. It was eerie and unnatural, and not even Hermione's wards of silver light would mimic the sickly color that painted the night sky. It was similar to the color of the killing curse, and it was enough that Hermione stood, eyes wide. Hermione? Torrhen's voice trailed off as he watched his friend stand rigidly on the wall next to him. Eyes focused on something in the distance, he too turned and saw the strange color that tinged the sky. Others, noticing their attention, began to trail off in their conversations to look towards the south, wondering what captured Hermione's attention. By the gods, breathed the horrified older soldier of the Corps Starks that had joined them, Wildfire. That's Wildfire? Asked Eddard, his voice carrying. The same older soldier nodded. What's Wildfire? Asked Hermione, her voice low in respect of the horror that rippled off those around her. Liquid that is so dangerous and volatile that a single mistake could destroy entire villages in seconds, answered a grim Meg. Only the pyromancers know how to create it, and when it burns, it does so uncontrollably, and water cannot stop it. Hermione shivered. It sounded like a terrible mix of fiend fire and Greek fire. That hangs over King's Landing, said a quiet Darren, whose observation cut through the group. King's Landing is burning, and for the sake of Caitlyn's mental state and Robb and Arya, Hermione hoped that Sansa was safe. The wildfire burned long into the night, even as the sun rose the following morning. Hermione and those with her had to continue in their plans to head east to complete the 7 remaining forts. A solid week of work, considering Lord Mooton's seat was on the Bay of Crabs and would want a fort similar to Lord Mallister's. There was no time to think or worry about what occurred south of them, especially if there was nothing they could immediately do. Hermione was finishing Lord Hade's fort at the base of the Mountains of the Moon, which loomed behind them, blue and imposing, 6 days later when they received news about King's Landing. Daisy and Eddard had great fun in telling Hermione all about the mountain clans and their ferocious attacks on people they thought trespassed on their land, making the young woman glance over her shoulder at the forested base of the mountain between casting her spells. Her nerves were already wrought when Robb called her on the mirror, but she stepped away from the group while remaining in Torrhen's watchful sight. She cast a muffalot at the same time to ensure privacy. Stannis Baratheon launched an attack on King's Landing several days ago, were the first words from his mirror self. He hadn't shaved or trimmed his beard, so he appeared rather scraggy, and there were bags under his eyes. We haven't heard much, but from what we do understand, the Lannisters in the capital were able to defeat him. Barely. What about your sister? Asked Hermione carefully. Did you get a hold of her? Robb's face shuddered. She's not answering. I have no idea if she even has the mirror. Hermione's teeth dropped to reside in her stomach. I'm sorry, Robb. He shook his head. Nothing you did, Hermione. Besides, what reports we have is that the Old Lion's attacks on us previously in the Riverlands, the battle you engaged him in first outside Riverrun, and then when you and Lord Bolton retook Harrenhal, seems to have cut his numbers. The mountain never came to King's Landing, so he must still be in the Riverlands somewhere. By not having much of call upon, as we had destroyed parts of his army, Tywin Lannister didn't have as much of a force as planned to engage with Stannis. We saw the wildfire on the horizon, though, said Hermione quietly. I'm sure that tipped the favor. Robb nodded grimly. To the Lannisters, it did. Stannis' fleet was all but destroyed. He did escape, as did several other ships, but most were burned by the wildfire or ripped apart. His foot soldiers didn't quite penetrate the walls, either. It was bad? Confirmed Hermione. Robb nodded. It was bad. The two were silent as they pondered what the attack on King's Landing would mean for Robb and his army. To Hermione, it meant that the Lannisters kept their hold on the capital and the largest population center, as well as in essence controlled a propaganda machine by virtue of being the resting place for the King of Westeros. Stannis Baratheon's defeat meant that his position as second to Robert Baratheon as the next in line to the throne failed, not just because of his personality, as she had heard, but because he lacked the military prowess to claim King's Landing as well. Where will you go next, Stannis? She wondered. How many more forts do you have to complete? Asked Robb suddenly, cutting into Hermione's thoughts. One, she replied instantly, as the phrase declined any help from my end. They've supplied their blood, though, through Blackwalder. So once you're done, the ward will be up. It's already up, confirmed Hermione. I'm just tying the remaining forts into it. The blood sacrifice is about intent with the blood ritual. Really as a means to reinforce the idea of what the ward stands for, since everyone wanted the protection of the ward, their blood sacrifice was strong, and their intentions tied to the forts quickly. Excellent, replied Robb, some of the tension in his face bleeding away. Return to Riverrun immediately. Don't linger in the Riverlands. I'd feel better knowing you are, and the others, that is, are back here safe. Hermione raised her eyebrows at the king's near slip, but nodded. See you soon, she said, and then, fine. She stored the mirror away in her beaded bag and turned back to the final additions on the High Fort. If they were lucky and pressed, they could even finish the Vibrant Fort that evening and back in their feather beds before midnight. All right, everyone, called Hermione, catching their attention, and she returned to the group, dropping the muffalato as well. We have a change in plans. Who wants to be back at Riverrun tonight? There was no time to rest when they returned. The ward was a visible, shimmering reminder on the map that hung in Riverrun's war room. It guaranteed that Robb's plan could continue forward with the protection of the Riverlands secured. There was no time to test the ward, so everyone was waiting on tenterhooks to see which fort would be used first and the inevitable complaints that would come via Raven from others in Westeros. In the meantime, Riverrun was a hive of activity as Robb continued to press them to return north to liberate Winterfell. What food that could be spared was placed aside, and then Hermione would cast an enlarging charm on some loaves of bread or on a pile of vegetables, as well as a Gemino to ease the burden with winter approaching. She did this in between casting her portkey charms on the pins, a little over halfway complete. To her, however, she felt guilt at being unable to dedicate more time to the food stores, but she had to prioritize her time and spells. There was only one of her in Riverrun, and more for her to do than possible. A month later, Robb had called a full meeting, and the Riverlands and Northern Lords were once more around the table in his war room. The pace will be brutal and long, he announced after several others had finished their reports on their troops, the food, their weapons, and any information on their enemies. Autumn may have much of Westeros in her grip, but we know that we are marching towards winter, and winter is coming. There was a roar of approval by the Northern Lords and some Riverlands lords at Robb's words. His lips stretched into a tiny pleased smile as he surveyed them all. We are looking at least a moon's length for the journey between here and the Twins, where Lord Frey has graciously allowed us to rest, continued Robb. We will be there for several weeks, conducting what I've been told is a summit. All Riverlands lords and Northern Lords are encouraged to join us on the journey. Those of you who are Riverlands lords, however, know that you have done your duty to your king and land, defending it from Lannisters and other unsavory bastards who wish to do you and yours harm. With the ward now protecting the Riverlands, we only just have to smoke out the wily bastards of the Old Lion and end them. It was time for the Riverlands lords to cheer loudly. I will not order you to march north with me, my friends. The young king's smile had dropped, and now he was solemn as he stopped and rested his eyes on those who were in the room with him. It will be your choice, should you wish to come north, but I promise to those of you who do, you will find glory, and you will find iron-born squids to stick your swords into. I have protected your home, now I ask you to join me north to protect mine. There was not a single voice that did not loudly proclaim their desire to join their king. Their voices shook the wooden beams above, and the fire in the large hearth behind Robb shifted and flickered as the air around it was displaced. At his side, Hermione beamed up at him in pride, and he glanced down at her, flushed with success. He had fought battles and won them. He had her help in protecting the Riverlands and kept the allegiance of his men. Little could go wrong for them. Robb had to raise both his hands to quiet the room, but it took time. Once the cheers died down, he spoke loudly so that his voice carried, but ensured his tone was pleasant. The summit at the Twins will be to discuss our battle plans for Winterfell and the liberation of the western coast, where Ironborn are raiding. The eastern coast must remain vigilant for the remains of Stannis' fleet, but our focus will be the west and inwards, readying ourselves for winter. Furthermore, he raised his voice over some murmurs. The summit will provide me with the opportunity to hand out long overdue recognition for those in my service for their part in a battle, their military strength, and their continued loyalty. And what of a wedding, shouted Blackwalder from the back of the room. Will that occur as well, given that his grace is engaged to one of my kin? There was some embarrassed tittering by those, many shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It was an open secret where Robb's affection lay, even if neither he nor Hermione had ever done anything to encourage it or spoke about it. Robb flinched at the reminder, but gamely spoke, even if his mouth trembled a bit as he did so. I would hope that I could bring my new wife to Winterfell when it was free of any dangers. There's no point offering my bride a ruined home, or the uncertainty of traveling from battle to battle, or even the insult of doing so like a common camp whore. There was a stunned silence, but it settled some of Blackwalder's grumbles. even if he was not appreciative of the response. Very well. But soon, Robb nodded his head, slowly. Soon, he agreed, although the word tasted like ashes in his mouth. He kept his head forward and refused to glance to the side where he knew Hermione sat. He cleared his throat. I asked those Riverlands lords who will be joining us to the Twins and on to Winterfell, inform Lord Umber, Lord Karstark, or Lady Mormont at your earliest convenience. When no one spoke, he finished the meeting with, "We leave in a week's time at dawn." Robb was instantly swarmed with people wishing to speak to him, leaving Hermione to just watch. However, she was not alone long, as Bracken slipped up from his seat, nearly 10 down from where she sat at the head with Robb, to join her. "I assume our quick retreat from Riverrun is partially your doing?" he asked, his mouth twitching into a smile. Hermione nodded. "I've almost got all the pins Robb wanted to be done, complete. Within the next 2 days, I should have the rest if I'm working on them exclusively, and we both decided that wasting any more time is silly." "Oh?" Hermione's gaze turned back to the young king, who was listening with a serious expression on his face as Nori and Ironsmith were speaking to him. The clan in Lesser House could only support Robb with a few soldiers, but their loyalty was absolute, and the young wolf knew it. "He misses the north," she said quietly, turning back to Bracken. "He wants to go home, see who is left, and what Theon did to Winterfell, and continue to track Bran and Rickon." Bracken nodded. "I can see the importance in that," he sighed. "Well, I don't think I've ever seen the north in winter, so it'll be a first for me." Hermione's eyes grew wide. "You'll be going north?" The look Bracken gave her made her feel 2 feet tall. "Hey! My nephew Henry and my son Harry will maintain Stonehenge for me, while I continue to serve King Robb and the royal family." The returning look Hermione sent him was one of confusion mixed with suspicion. As far as she knew, Bracken had little to no interaction with Catelyn Stark, the Queen Regent with Robb's ascension to king in the north, or with Arya, who is by all rights now a prince. So what member of the royal family was he talking about? Edmure? And, he continued, speaking over anything Hermione would ask for clarification, "I know that Tytos will be doing the same." "Well, he makes a bit more sense," said Hermione slowly, trying to not offend. "Given that his eldest remains at Raventry Hall and Lucas is part of Robb's guard, he still has 3 other sons in his family seat." "2, the man himself announced as he strode up to her and Bracken, as I've written for Hoss to join us on the way." He turned to Hermione directly. "If you may remember, Lady Hermione, Hoster was the one who helped us lay our grievances to join as ally. Hoss is a bit bookish, but I figure he might be able to help you in your pursuit of discovering texts on magic." Hermione was taken aback by the suggestion. "Lord Blackwood, that's very kind of you. Thank you. I'd welcome his help." "Excellent." The tall, black-haired man grinned. It was sharp and predatory as he cut his eyes at Bracken, who was visibly annoyed. "Closer ties between House Blackwood and yourself are always a good idea." "Oh, so that's what this is about," thought Hermione. With a roll of her eyes, Bracken's response was nearly a snarl. "I'm sure that Lady Hermione would welcome some more company of the female persuasion. Perhaps I will write Barbara and ask her to join. I'm sure she and Lady Hermione would like to reacquaint themselves. Barbara spoke highly of her before we left." Hermione let out a loud huff as the 2 men continued to size each other up, deciding to leave them to their posturing. Honestly, man, it appeared that despite burying the hatchet, so to speak, the 2 men were eager to continue feuds wherever possible. "At least it's with words to rile each other up and not swords," she thought with a final shrug. Instead of taking the river road east to the inn at the crossroads, and then taking the King's Road north, Robb decided to cut across the countryside to cut their travel time down considerably. They began their journey to Winterfell via the Twins, a week later by heading directly north from Riverrun by crossing the Red Fork. Robb rode on the back of his horse, Grey Wind at his side, as they led the procession. The entire northern army was joining them to retake their home, but several Riverlands lords had joined as well. Some soldiers were only token amounts, like Lyman Derry, who was barely a tween and could spare little men. Others, like Bracken and Blackwood, left only token amounts at their keeps instead. However, the northern lords well outnumbered the Riverlands lords regardless. Arya was infuriated to hear she was staying behind at Riverrun, with Edmure watching over her as her guardian, while Catelyn joined Robb to the Twins. Brian would remain behind as Arya's protector, and under Robb's orders to continue giving her swordplay lessons. Even Jaime Lannister would remain behind, secure in his warded room by Hermione's magic. Hermione rode behind Torrhen on a shared steed. Surrounded by those she considered friends in Westeros, the Starks, both Rickard and his son Eddard, Bracken and Blackwood, and Lord Bolton. Just in front of her small group was Robb, with Catelyn at his side, surrounded by his guard of Daisy, Lucas, Darren, and Patrick, and Maggie Mormont, the Great John and Small John Umber, and Black Walder Frey. The rest of the Northern Lords and Riverlands Lords joining them were scattered up and down the line. Hermione had spent the morning spelling carts laden with food and supplies with featherlight charms for the horses, and then said goodbye to Gendry for his help with the pins, the last of which she had finished the night before, except for some detachment of Mormont, Darry, and Forrester men. "Why not?" she asked Robb, over dinner as they remained in his war room the night before they left, his eyes downcast and focused on making notations in a ledger. "I want to send them around the twins," he answered. "Around?" gasped Hermione. "Are they not coming with us? Do you suspect something is wrong with the twins?" Robb shook his head, looking up. "No. It's a mere precaution. I'll send them around towards Greywater March to meet with Lord Howland Reed. Instead, I'm thinking of splitting the army into two then, to meet up at Moat Cailin from two different sides to attack it." Hermione pensively nodded. "You're not putting all your eggs in one basket." The stupefied look on Robb's face made her laugh loudly. What? Hermione? What?" The first leg of the journey was short, and the weather was clear with sunny, if not chilled, skies. The mountainous terrain near River Run alongside the banked Red Fork River quickly turned to lush, fertile fields. The head of the procession passed farmers and small villages, preparing for harvests, finally free of being tormented by several large warring armies. They'd cheer it, recognizing the Stark banners proudly displayed alongside many familiar Riverlands ones as they rode by until they reached Fairmarket. While there were clear and sunny skies for them, it seemed that Fairmarket had a recent downpour. The majority of the army remained far from the town, camped out on muddy fields that made everyone miserable. Robb gathered his mother, his guard, as well as several natural leaders he preferred to join him in the town, where at a local inn, they met with the innkeeper. "I'm sorry, my lord," the man apologized, "but the heavy rains we had the last few days swept the bridge right away." "How large was the bridge?" asked Umber. The innkeeper shrugged. "No more than a cart's span, my lord. And it was old. Very old. I doubt it would have held your army's crossing." Robb grit his teeth and turned to Hermione. "Hermione, do you think you could—" "What? Fix it? Reinforce it," she replied, a bit snappish. It was the longest she'd been on a horse in Westeros, and she was not appreciating the fact that she was off the ground for any longer than necessary. She would have preferred operating the distance in short bursts, but Robb worried about her safety and forbade it. She still could have done it, but whether it was going to be worth the anger her friend carried, well, she didn't care much for that. "Any," replied Robb. Hermione shrugged. "I'd have to see what there is to work with." Nothing, as it turned out. When the innkeeper said it was swept away, he meant all of it. There were no supplies left for Hermione to use magic to rebuild the bridge, unless some of Robb's army wanted to become lumberjacks for a few days. When Hermione returned to the inn with the news, Robb's frown deepened. It was practically a scowl when the Blackfish swore and brought the latest news from King's Landing to those in the inn via their parchments. "Oh, what now?" thought Hermione crossly. "Am your rights," the man began, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Ravens have been sent to all of the great houses in Westeros. It seems that there was a wedding in King's Landing after the Lannisters drove back Stannis." "The inbred twit married his Rose?" asked Karstark with a jeer. The Blackfish shook his head, a wolf to a lion. The room grew dangerously silent. At his side, Catelyn paled and swayed, her hands reaching behind to grab onto the back of a chair. "What?" The word that escaped Robb's lip was a low rumble, half a growl. "Tyrion Lannister wed Princess Sansa," confirmed the Blackfish, his hands holding the parchment shaking. "The ceremony was at least a week ago, now." There was a sense of stunned disbelief through the group. Hermione, who didn't know Sansa well, or at all, having only heard about her through Robb, Arya, and any Stark bannermen who came from Winterfell, did wonder about the reaction. Yes, it was bad. Sansa was essentially a teen girl surrounded by enemies. Marriage was meant as a tie to her new family, but in Westeros, things could easily change and her new husband could easily die in battle. Hermione's bigger concern was that Tyrion Lannister was clearly Jaime Lannister's family, and she was worried that he had a similar personality and would take it out on the teen. This may, began Glover, finding his voice and making himself heard in the room. "This may be the best time for you to write your will and define the laws of succession, your grace." "Or think now is the best time," snapped Catelyn, turning to the man. "You are not thinking clearly, my lord. My girl is in the bosom of the enemy. We need to figure out a way to get her back." The number of disbelieving stares that were sent Catelyn's way echoed the very thoughts that Hermione shared about the situation. "Eddard, Dacey, please escort my mother out, would you?" "Robb!" The two guards, with half-embarrassed, half-stoic expressions on their faces, did as their king bid, leading a protesting Catelyn from the inns downstairs to the room she was assigned upstairs. Once she was gone from view, Robb sighed heavily. "I will not be trading the Kingslayer for my sister," said Robb quietly. "There are other plans in motion for her retrieval. The laws of succession are clear. Sansa, married to a Lannister, will never inherit Winterfell or the title of a Queen of Winter. Prince Bran would be the next," offered Karstark quietly. "Both my brothers are missing," said Robb, glancing around the room. "While we know they are alive, we do not have the time to find them and bring them back to Winterfell. Arya remains the only other Stark free and safe. Princess Arya, your grace, certainly has the viciousness to be queen in the north," began Umber, with a tentative smile that had several standing in the room chuckle, as they all knew of Arya's temperament, but she is barely 10 and 4 years and has no practical experience in leading. "Then Jon," sighed Robb. "He's the same age as I and has had the same training. He'll leave the Night's Watch, forsake his oaths?" Bolton's mouth turned down at the suggestion. "The Stark name is built on oaths and honor, your grace. Having Snow take up your mantle as king in the north while indisposed is certainly acceptable, but not as an alternative." Robb spun and snapped at his men. "Then what would you have me do, Bolton? If all my siblings fail to meet your expectations, what solution is there?" "Marry," said Blackwalder in a straightforward manner, as if he was announcing the sky was blue, winter was cold. "We are visiting my father's home within a fortnight. The terms of your alliance with the phrase are marriage. Pick one of my kin and marry the chit." Robb's flushed cheeks drained of color quickly, leaving him the color of sour milk. He turned his back on his men in the room, staring towards the stairs, making it so that none saw his face. He took several deep breaths, and Hermione's heart ached. Eventually, he turned, his face expressionless. "My lords, prepare parchment. I will write out my will and send several copies out to you in case of capture." The terms were written out in Karstark's hand as he had the nicest writing and witnessed by those in the room. Maegay Mormont, the great John Umber, Roose Bolton, Blackwalder, Galbert and his son Robert Glover, and Hermione. When Robb signed his name at the bottom of the last of the 3 documents, Grey Wind, who had been left outside, howled. Several jumped at the unexpected noise, but Hermione was looking directly at the young wolf and saw his blue eyes flash, a strange silver tinge to them, and then Grey Wind stopped howling and his eyes were normal. "Lady Mormont," said Robb, his voice tight and emotionless. "Your grace," replied the Lady of Bear Island. Robb turned to look at her. "Take the 2 other lords you've chosen with you and head north, like we previously discussed. Take 1 copy of the will with you as well." "Now, your grace," the woman looked startled. Robb nodded. "Now, you have your orders. Depart immediately." "Where's she going?" muttered Umber. Hermione leaned forward and shushed him gently, although it was too quiet for the man to hear. "As for the rest of us," continued Robb in the same dead tone, "we will rest here tonight and in the morning and head along the Green Fork until we find some trees to fell. Hermione," he called her name, and she turned to face him. "Will you be able to use your magic and create a bridge for us to cross on the east side of the Twins? With enough lumber?" "Yes," she confirmed, her voice low. Robb nodded at her confirmation and then swept from the room, up the stairs, with Garen and Lucas following him. The rest of the group milled around for a moment or two, some like Blackwalder, glaring at everyone, and then they broke away, either to tables for a meal, or like Hermione, upstairs for sleep. Although she was sure that, like many others, including Robb, she didn't sleep that evening, as her own thoughts of what awaited them at the Twins kept her up. They ended up riding through 4 days straight of an icy downpour, and 2 more spent in freezing rain while the army cut down trees, and Hermione used her magic to help build a bridge for them to cross on day 7. The rain and the cold conditions kept the soldiers from working a peak performance, and even Hermione was having difficulty, and she had her magic to keep her warm or to repel rain from her jacket. Hermione's warming charm on herself and Torrhen kept them comfortable when on horseback, but having to reapply it so many times meant that it was losing its potency, and Hermione had lost feeling in her toes several hours ago on the 8th day. She was unsure how the others were handling the weather without a warming charm, dressed in thick furs that grew heavy when damp and leather boots that did nothing to keep the water out. On the 9th day, they had sun for several hours until the late afternoon, just as the sun was going down. Then a miserable drizzle began to spit down in a steady curtain, just as cold and biting as the downpour they rode through earlier. The ground was warm from the day's earlier sunlight, and the quick cold rain and cloud cover combined to create a thick, unmoving fog. The twins appeared ahead of the army, two large arms stretching towards the sky from a thick fog that rose several stories high, shrouding much of the surrounding area. From the head of the army procession, Robb called for them to make camp several leagues south of the twins along the banks of the Green Fork, which was rushing by them, thick and white with icy storm water. The banks of the river had burst their normal levees, and although the river was banked, it was wide and menacing with the strength it rushed by them with. There was little talk as tents were pitched and wagons unhooked from horses, and oxen lighting a fire was going to be near impossible unless Hermione helped out with an inflammary as well as a water-repelling charm on the flames to keep it going all night and in the rain. As such, she and Torrhen were walking through the camp, Hermione casting her spells at pre-made campfires like she had been doing so the entire trip. Both were near the end of the procession, ready to head back, when Torrhen suddenly stiffened. "What is it?" asked Hermione, shoving her heavy wet curls off her forehead to peer into the same dark gloom and fog he was looking towards. "Something," he muttered, trailing off. "Something isn't right. It's too quiet." "Quiet?" asked an incredulous Hermione, turning back to the fog. It was too thick for her to see anything, much less the head of the procession where Robb's tent was. Behind her, the fog presented ghostly figures that moved from one camp tent to another. Other than the low murmur of noise from the camp, the prevailing sound was the thunderous rush of water. Turning back to face forward, Hermione concentrated ahead. Torrhen's still body beside her reminded Hermione of a hunting dog, ears perked forward and poised to burst into a dash after a rabbit or fox it had sniffed out. Despite her own misgivings that anyone would want to be out in the rain and fog, Hermione trusted Torrhen's instincts. Wingardium Revelio thought, Hermione, her wand facing in front of her. The charm burst from her wand, casting no light, and pushed against the fog, which rippled for just a moment as the spell moved through the condensation. Then, ahead, a human body, outlined in red, appeared. And then another, and another, and another, and then dozens until the entire fog ahead of her was lit with the red outline of humans in front of the rear of their army. Torrhen unsheathed his sword, the steel ringing as he did so. In response, an arrow burst through the fog and missed Hermione by inches, slamming into the ground behind her, between two Nori soldiers who stared at it dumbfounded. Hermione pointed her wand at her throat, thinking sonorous, and then shouted, "Attack! We're under attack from the rear." That was the signal, as the men in the fog let out a mighty roar, and the ground thundered as they raced forward. Behind her, the two Nori soldiers leaped to their feet, their own swords in their hands, and they readied themselves for battle. Up and down the line, deep in the fog, a clanging warning bell was going off. There were shouts as the northern Riverlands army wondered where their enemy was coming from. At the front of the attack, leading the large band of men in gold and red and chainmail, was an incredibly large man, his own sword raised high. Hermione was rooted to her spot as she realized who the man was. The Mountain, Gregor Clegane, he's here! Her eyes widened as she realized he was rushing straight towards her, with only Torrhen between them. The alarm took its time to reach Robb. Initially, he was stuck at the front of the procession of the army, watching as some soldiers helped him pitching his tent. However, Grey Wind was pacing in an aggravated manner. His ears pushed back and low against his head, and long, deep growls erupted from his snout whenever he turned towards the dense fog that hid the rest of the camp. Something seemed off. Robb frowned as he looked around, turning this way and that. His skin was itching, and Grey Wind's agitation was fueling his own. "Your Grace?" asked someone, but Robb tuned them out, facing towards the rear of the camp. He narrowed his eyes, trying to peer through the gloom. It swirled around the men, walking back and forth, carrying sacks or sitting down around blue flames that Hermione charmed. The voice tried again. "You, Grace? What is it?" "Sss," he muttered absently, straining his ears. "Was that Is that a fight? And then there was a clamor as bells began to ring, first far away and down from the rear of the army, and then up through the line as soldiers jumped to their feet, reaching for their swords. From far away, they heard Hermione's voice carry, "Attack! We're under attack from the rear." Instantly, Robb lurched forward, drawing his own sword as his guard, Darren, Dacey, Eddard, Lucas, swarmed to form a square around him, their eyes facing outward in all directions. "What are you doing?" he demanded, shouting. "We need to go." "Your Grace, please," said a very strained Dacey. "Our job is to protect you. We don't know who or where the enemy is in this fog." Robb's temper swirled and grew from the pit of his stomach, a physical thing that ran up his spine and made the hairs at the nape of his neck rise. Gray wind snarled, and saliva dripped from between his teeth and down his jaw. Eddard shuddered. Robb grit his teeth and turned, spotting Lord Ryger nearby. Eyes flashing, he snapped, "Ryger, find my mother and escort her along with a dozen men straight to the twins." The man startled, but nodded hastily. "Yes, of course, Your Grace." He immediately turned on his heel and strode off, barking his own orders to men he saw, grabbing one or two by the arm as they tried to rush by him. Robb turned away from the man, mollified that he would at least follow his orders, and then glared balefully around at his guard. "Keep up, would you?" he snapped at them, and strode towards the rear of the camp, dodging between rushing soldiers and shouting river lords, all the while with his guard dogging his steps. Grey Wind kept pace, loping around and streaking past men and around tents until he suddenly paused, nose in the air. Robb's blood turned to ice when Grey Wind threw his head back and howled. In those brief seconds before Clegane reached her, Hermione thought of only three things. The first being, don't let this turn into a repeat of your first year at Hogwarts. Hermione, there's no Harry or Ron to save you from the mountain troll this time. The second was, good God, this man is huge. And the third, move your arse, Granger. Hermione launched herself sideways towards Torrhen and accidentally pushed her magic towards him to shove him out of the mountain's path with a wandless and non-verbal expulso. While the spell was normally intended for more violent means, Hermione's natural desire to see her friends safe had him landing on the earth with an oof, bouncing slightly as it turned squishy. And she pivoted on her heel, facing the oncoming man, and whipped her right arm out, letting her wand slip from the holster into her waiting palm. She bent her knees slightly and then swung her right arm up and around, a bright, vivid red bursting from the wand as she screamed, "Defendo!" In a truly amazing display of athleticism, the mountain twisted his body away from the bright light, tilting his head and letting the spell graze past him, slicing open his cheek as his head rolled along. The spell then hit one of his men behind him, and the man nearly tore in two with the force of Hermione's magic. In return, when Clegane turned to face Hermione head-on, she saw his eyes narrow in anger, and he roared at her, lifting his sword high to come down on a slash. Protego, she thought, her wand pointed up and head into the swing to block it. The shield slamming into place in front of her just as the sword swung down. There was a loud clang as it hit, and Hermione grit her teeth, the blow vibrating the invisible shield, making it ripple. "Die, you stupid magical cunt," the man shouted in her face. His breath rose hotly from his mouth, visible puffs of the air forming clouds around his face as he bore his weight down onto the sword, and the spell sending Hermione down to one knee. She blinked away the freezing rain that continued to pound down on her, icy prickles turning her cheeks cold. She brought her other hand up to hold on to the bottom of her right hand and glared at the man. Around her, the mountain's men crashed into the rear of the Northern Riverlands army. Like a tidal wave sweeping an unsuspecting beach, the wave crashing into the wet and weary soldiers, men shouted and cried, and the very ground beneath them, already slick with freezing rain, began to tint red. Hermione's knees slid and skid, and she fell backward onto her rear, losing connection to her spell as it popped. Without the pressure against his sword, the mountain stumbled forward, and Hermione rolled to the side to avoid the tit. She popped up with her back facing the large man and swung around with her wand. A long sliver of icy blue-white fire gushed from it, coiling and sparking with audible hisses as she twisted and whipped her wand towards the man, the thin flame snapping out and catching the mountain's arm. The man howled in pain, leaping backward from her. His silver armor was blackened and burnt. The metal was spitting and steam rose from it in the cool air, as the whip has gone straight through to the skin, blistering it red. He eyed her warily. For her part, Hermione stood there in the midst of battle, watching the large man while her heart pounded furiously in her chest. She panted heavily, her own breath escaping in tiny bursts, hot against the cold air. The flame whip at her side matched her signature bluebell fire, making it an extension of the waterproof flames, and as it obeyed its caster, the fire whip curled comfortably around her without burning. The mountain twisted his sword in his hand, spinning the blade, and began to ease around Hermione, keeping his eyes trained on her. In response, she cracked out the whip again, letting it snap down just to his left. He jumped hastily to avoid it, and she then volleyed the spell there. He again jumped to avoid it. Inwardly, she laughed, thinking he looked like a startled rabbit. "Think you're funny, do you, bitch?" he muttered, sensing her humor in the situation. She smirked. Deciding to try his luck, he burst forward, slashing sideways and forcing Hermione to bend awkwardly to avoid the blade while she swung her hand out to coil her whip around. She landed a solid hit on his back, making him cry out and arch his back. The metal sizzled, and there was the acrid smell of burnt flesh. Hermione grimaced and skipped away. However, one of his men raced at her, dragging his sword behind and alongside his body to sweep up and slice her open. Then, Torrhen was there, blocking the man's sword with his own to the point that sparks flew where the steel collided. "All right, my lady," he hollered over his shoulder, eyes forward and brows narrowed at the dirty and haggard man in front of him. "Never met her," she called back with a grin, and found herself then back to back with him, facing out at the mountain, who was recovering, stretching, and standing tall. "Glad you're here, Torrhen." The Karstark scoffed. "Where else would I be but watching your back, milady?" She grinned and snapped the fire whip, churning up a line of blackened grass and mud as she did so. She did it again for effect and felt her confidence grow as the mountain eyed the ground warily. "You can't hold that forever," he called out, nastily. She glared at him and muttered, "Just watch me." Behind her, Torrhen pushed the soldier he was fighting off, and Hermione took that to mean she had to engage too, and ducked under a swing of the man's sword that was parallel to the ground. But he recovered from his one-handed swing to grab the hilt with both hands, and changed direction, bringing the sword down towards her. Hermione dropped to her knees, and swung the whip, catching the man's ankle. He roared and staggered, slamming his sword into the earth to hold himself up. Hermione pressed her advantage, backhanding the whip to come from the other direction and catching his right bicep, cutting through his armor and shirt underneath, biting into his skin and cauterizing the wound almost immediately as it dug in. The man recovered, yanking his sword and flinging it up and out. Hermione yelped, tripping backward on her boots, and the sword tip caught her hip. It was instantly on fire, pain radiating out from the thin line that cut through her jeans. Blood immediately began to well from the cut and down the fabric, mingling with the rain. Shit, she thought, glancing down and letting her left hand press flutteringly at her hip. Clegane charged towards her, intent to catch her other side and skewer her. His sword pointed straight at her to ram through. She turned sideways, and the man rushed by her, his larger, heavier body knocking in her and sending her sprawling to the ground. Her wand fell from her hand and rolled away. Triumph bloomed in his eyes as he twisted on his foot, planting it heavily behind him in a ready pose. He raised his arms in a two-handed grip of the hilt and swung down. Hermione squeezed her eyes shut. "Robb, I'm sorry." A loud clang above her made her eyes pop open. She was ready to see Torrhen standing over her, using his body as protection, but it wasn't him. Instead, she looked up at a very tall, large man with tattered clothes, parts burnt and smelling like fire, and covered in dirt and muck and other stains. His black hair was long and scraggly in the rain, plastered to his neck and the side of his face, which was horribly puckered and burned. "Out of the way, runt," the mountain snarled, pressing hard against the man's blade. Unlike many others who had faltered, this man met his force and pushed back, the ground beneath his boots slipping and caving in. "Fuck you," he snarled back. "I'll kill you," the mountain was enraged, his eyes wild as he stared at Hermione's savior. The man was unmoved, however, and snapped back. "Not if I kill you first, brother." Hermione's eyes widened. Then, the two were fighting, their swords a blur, and only visible whenever they struck one another, sparks flying off. The clang of their ringing steel was lost in the cacophony of other steel hitting steel, and the shouts of the men around them. The two brothers moved in a tight circle, one always pressing, and then backing off, or dodging, or leaning out of the way of the sword. Taking the brief respite, Hermione eased to her feet, Looking around for her wand, spotting it a few feet from her, she thrust her palm out angrily and summoned it back to her non-verbally. It zoomed through the air and slammed into her hand, sensing her emotional state. "I'm not letting you go that easily," she thought nastily, launching herself forward and ducking under the Mountain's brother's arm as he completed an attack towards the Mountain's chest. "For Barbara, you asshole." Hermione slammed her hands to the freezing ground, her wand flat against it as she shouted, "Glacius!" Around her, the air dropped quickly, and the man protecting her swore, dancing backward and behind her. Eyes closed. From under her palms burst a silvery light, which instantly froze. It quickly spread, snaking out and doubling, then tripling in size like a growing puddle of ice. "What the fuck is this?" snarled the Mountain, glaring down at it. It reached the man's boots and began to freeze them. He swore and began hacking at the ice as its fingers crawled up his boots and then his calves. Within seconds, he was unable to move, his feet encased in ice. As it thickened and hardened, the ice continued to grow until it hit his waist, trapping half his body. Despite his size and strength, the man was unable to continue to hack at the ice. His skin quickly paled, turning clammy, and his lips tinged blue. What? Hermione's eyes opened. "Fuck me," muttered the other Clegane. Hermione's eyes were a vibrant, glowing amber lit from within. The thick sheet of ice that spilled from her hands and towards the Mountain cracked and splintered, creating long, thick shards. The cracked shards trembled and slowly rose. Despite the continued freezing rain coating the ice, the weight didn't cause them to dip heavily. Instead, the ice built up on the shards, making them larger. "For Barbara," the young witch murmured. "For justice." And then the shards were expelled forward directly at the Mountain. Unable to move, unable to escape or twist away, the thick ice shards hit the man with the force of a bludger hitting a Quidditch player, jerking the man back as they perforated his armor to the point of sticking out behind him, bloodied. The man gasped and gurgled, blood sputtering from his mouth before trickling down into his well-groomed dark beard. And then he stilled, slumping forward and bent at the waist. Hermione closed her eyes again and took a deep breath, exhaling it slowly. Then she pulled her hands from the ground, palms sticking to the ice and pulling at her skin, ripping some from her. She curled her hands into fists to hide the evidence and rose, swaying a bit. At her side, the other Clegane stared at her, his jaw clenching and his fingers twitching on the hilt of his sword. He was unsure if she was a threat to him. As they eyed each other up, the battle around them was quietening into just the cries of the wounded. Somewhere, a part of her recognized that Torrhen was angrily stabbing felled soldiers, ensuring their deaths, an inability to get back up for an attack on a turn back. Gregor Clegane did not have many men, not more than 3 dozen or so, but they had created enough chaos that they had ransacked and ripped several tents down, as well as destroyed a few of her fire pits. The attack had come as a surprise, and several soldiers from the rear were badly wounded, if not dead. "Lady Hermione," a voice called, and she turned to face it. On horseback, galloping towards her through the fog, Lord Bolton appeared, his own sword in his right hand, bloodied. He came to a rest near her, his eyes coolly assessing the tall, scarred man beside her. His sword began to rise. "He protected me." The words were out of her mouth before she had time to think. "I would have died if it weren't for him." Bolton presented the man with suspicious disbelief. "And what is Joffrey Lannister's dog doing so far north?" The man scowled, "Trying to live my damn life, kill my brother." He jerked his head towards Hermione, saw this one in trouble, and thought to save her, if only for a reward. Bolton's eyes cooled further, and he controlled his prancing, nervous horse. "Why would we reward you, Hound?" The Lannister lapdog. Clegane's scowl deepened. "I'm no one's dog. Not even the Pretender King's." "Fuck the king," he spat. Bolton wheeled his horse around, twisting his head and keeping the man in his sight. Eventually, he said, not looking at her, "Lady Hermione, His Grace is asking if you can send the wounded to the twins, or down the river, at least to the head of the camp. We will be moving them to the castle immediately." Hermione started. "Oh? I thought we were too far away and too early for Lord Frey." "It seems that when the battle began, His Majesty sent his mother and a few men to the twins for protection," explained Bolton quietly. "And Lord Frey saw that we are granted immediate access. He sent men out as well to help with the wounded." With a sigh, Hermione nodded. Pointing her wand at the nearest injured soldier, she muttered with a flick at them. Mobile corpus. That soldier rose, floating gently in the rain, and she began walking until she reached two rather suspicious Frey bannermen carrying a stretcher between them. She deposited the man onto the stretcher, and then headed back for the next. It took several hours, to the point where she was bone-deep chilled, but she helped with the recovery of injured soldiers and healed what she could with spells to give them a chance of survival. Bolton kept Clegane in his sight the whole time, monitoring the field from his horse as he directed others until all that remained was bloodied, churned up earth. Bolton's eyes softened as they rested on her, and Hermione knew as she balefully looked up at him that she looked a bit like a drowned rat, her voluminous curly hair plastered flat and heavy on her shoulders. "Take yourself and Sandor Clegane to the front of the camp, my lady," the pale man instructed, "and get some rest." Hermione, too tired to do anything else, wearily nodded and grabbed onto Clegane's arm. He started, beginning to say, "What the fuck?" but Hermione spun on her heel and apparated them to where she had last seen Robb and his men begin pitching his tent. After the frantic fight on the Green Fork, Hermione was ready for some downtime, even if it was at the Twins. They reappeared in the space where Robb's tent had been, torn down after the end of the battle. Looming before her were two towering structures on either side of the foamy, gray, churning river. Something about the sight of them made her stomach clench uneasily. Both towers were identical in size and shape, two jutting, rectangular, gray blocks of stone that rose from the banks of the riverside. The castles each had one outer and one inner wall, with two separate courtyards and internal buildings for stables, garrisons, and other miscellanies. However, the imposing structures also boasted two very imposing gates, one facing the land on either side of the Twins, and one facing the bridge, guarded by hard-eyed Frey bannermen. The bridge was thick and long. It required 3 large foundation blocks to support the arch bridge, and with a dense fog rolling across the water from the north, much of the bridge was unseen, invisible to the naked eye through the fizzy rain. Hermione stumbled and accidentally leaned close to the towering man with the partially burnt face next to her. At her side, Sandor Clegane was swearing up a storm, half on his knees, and he groaned in pain and vomited up a mixture of regurgitated food and stomach bile. "You fucking cunt," he was saying, halfway between a sob and snarl. His scowl twisted the scarred side of his face, deepening it, and his dark eyes cut towards her. His lank hair reminded her of Professor Snape's, long, limp, and plastered to his forehead, and along his neck with the damp rain. Hermione looked at him, torn between complete apathy that was lined with the tiniest embers of sympathy in her chest. "It'll pass." "It fucking better." Those who straggled in with Hermione, the last of those carried by Freys and other Northern and Riverland soldiers that were alive, were exhausted from the mad battle, several with injuries of some kind. Around them, on horses and foot, were men in the colors of the Twins, rushing about to help the most injured, and a few more on horseback pushing past them, thinking to provide cover for an enemy that was no longer there. "Lady Hermione," called Torrhen, striding towards her through the crowd with an angry look on his face. It made her stand up, straight, and look him in the eyes as he stopped a mere arm's length from her. "If you ever, and I mean ever, do something like that again." Hermione glared at her friend, although her body was exhausted, and she was sure it came across more as weary than angry. "Hopefully it won't be that down to the wire, Torrhen, but if you plan on finishing that sentence, I'm going to turn you into a ferret. Trust me, I've seen it happen, and it wasn't pleasant." Torrhen's face twisted, but he snapped his mouth shut. Instead, he bit out, "His Grace wants to see you." His eyes cut the tall man beside her, finally straightening from his apparition-induced vomit trip, who used to be a Lannister man through and through, and his nose twitched in disgust. "I suppose I'll find somewhere for you, Hound." "Anywhere with ale," moaned the man as he straightened. Fucking cunts. Fucking witches. What the fuck? Hermione rolled her eyes and took off to find the king. Robb was easy to spot in the crowd, the shining auburn of his hair amongst the silver and dull browns and grays of the Twins and soldiers around them, with Grey Wind pacing angrily at the side and snapping his jaws at Twin soldiers on horseback, many of which were, although unnerved by the large beast, he was gesturing angrily to those of his guard around him, one arm flailing back and forth. As she got closer, she could hear the anger thrumming in his voice. "Weren't expecting to be attacked, Lord Frey. It was hardly our fault." "Be as that may," began a lean, hungry-looking man with a slight hunch next to Robb, "you did bring Lannister soldiers to me and mine. Of course we are willing to help where we can." I need a meister for the most injured, of course, interrupted Robb, donning his lofty king voice as Hermione called it. If you'd permit, I'd leave those behind to convalesce in the twins and set up camp here outside. Outside? The man, Walder Frey, asked. His tone was incredulous, but his face barely moved. As Hermione approached to stand just behind Robb and to the side, she watched as his eyes swept over the incoming soldiers, some who required triage immediately, and others who were being helped to makeshift tents as they were popping up on the grounds around the bridge and gate, and then they rested on her. Hermione shivered. Nonsense, the Lord of the Twins mocked, eyes sliding back to Robb. Around him stood several unmoving men and women, all with the same weak chin, beaded eyes, or high forehead that Lord Frey had. We are to be family. Are we not? You are to marry one of my girls. Now would be the time to pick one. Heh, like Arwea, my daughter Walda, my daughter Derwa, or my daughter Waldra. His eyes roved over each of the women around him as he spoke, pointing them out with his gaze falling on the woman before moving on to the next. What about my eldest granddaughters, Janaea and Naella? Sarah and Sarah, granddaughters, are twins. Heh, he sighed when Robb remained unmoved. Well then, but first, guest rights. At the man's side, a servant, a steward or castellan, as Hermione had learned over the year in Westeros, stepped forward with a plate of bread and salt. He extended it to Robb, who took the bread, broke some off, and chewed. Frey's eyes gleamed, and he allowed his voice to carry over not just the royal party in Kingsguard, but those of his men as well. My honored guests, be welcome within my walls and at my table. I extend to you my hospitality and my protection in the light of the Seven. After Robb finished his bread, he formally and loudly announced, House Stark humbly accepts House Frey's hospitality and protection. Then he spoke softer. Lord Frey, my thanks for your hospitality. I realize that we are much earlier than you anticipated for our summit, but perhaps you can provide us with refuge, and men, in case the Lannisters chasing us push onward. Can I count on you? The man, whom Hermione could see a vague resemblance to Black Walder Frey in the coolly assessing eyes and hawkish nose, nodded slowly. Of course. Please, let my women set up rooms for you and yours. We can begin those talks you wish to have later tonight, he offered, turning partially for Robb to draw alongside him. Yes, a bit earlier than you anticipated, but still, we can make do. I will always make time for my liege. Robb nodded, and walking with Walder Frey, entered the nearest of the gates. The heavy iron was black-tipped, and Hermione, passing underneath it, felt a sense of foreboding that she wasn't quite sure how to respond to. The outer courtyard within the outer walls was filled with horses, smithies, and the twins' garrison on this side of the river. Frey was going on about the agenda for their peace talks, and plans for the Riverlands as Robb and the Northern Army continued northwards to return to Winterfell and begin their preliminary scouts westward to fight the Greyjoys. Hermione followed silently behind the two men, eyes on the back of Robb's head, and the dewdrops that lingered in his auburn hair darkened to a deep brown with the rain. She drew level with Catelyn, and absently reached out her other hand to Grey Wind, and he snuffled against her side. Eerie yellow eyes focused intently on the two men ahead of them, as well. My only request is that none of your men bring their weapons to my hall. The older man was wheezing, as they made to enter the inner wall. It's just a personal quirk, I'm sure you understand. Your Grace. Yes, of course, agreed Robb hastily, glancing around as the courtyard filled with injured northern men and Riverlands men, many who moaned with pain. And the witch, of course, the man continued. At the reference to her, Hermione jumped, her head snapping around to the man. She narrowed her eyes at him just as Robb glanced back warily at her and met her eyes, his mouth turned down in a frown as he spoke to the man at his side, despite never leaving her face. What do you mean? Walder Frey stopped walking, so Robb and those that followed did so too. The man stared hard at Robb when he turned back to the man. She carries some kind of weapon, does she not? Oh. No weapons, insisted Frey, a strange glint in his eyes. This is a peaceful talk between two allies, is it not? Robb swallowed. Yes, it is, but... The stare that Frey leveled against Robb made Hermione swallow back the instinctive desire to snap out a bat bogey hex. The two continued to negotiate and speak back and forth, but eventually, with a miserable look on his face, Robb turned back and walked the few paces over to her and his mother. Hermione, I'm sorry, Lord Frey. Hermione narrowed her eyes. She waved a hand around them, and instantly a strange buzzing noise cut their conversation off from anyone eavesdropping as the mufflietu kept them in a cone of silence. She dropped her own voice to a low murmur to say, "It seems really fishy that he doesn't want weapons in the hall, Robb." Robb, half confused, glanced at her. Fishy? Odd, you know. Weird. Strange. Hermione sighed. Look, I understand guest rights, I really do, but asking me to leave my wand behind is like asking you to leave Grey Wind outside. Magic is a part of me, just like he's a part of you. At Robb's wince, Hermione's mouth dropped open. You are kidding me. He thinks Grey Wind is going to scare his servants, protested Robb, but it sounded lame to them both, and he knew it. He sighed that he's not some sort of, I don't know, pet. That one brings into a hall. Hermione was silent for a few moments, staring hard at the man she considered a friend and maybe something more. That's bullshit. Robb's wince was more pronounced. I am aware, Hermione. What would you have me do? Refuse. Robb stared hard at Hermione and she refused to budge down. Robb, Hermione's tone left no more for argument. Are you the king here, or is Frey? I am, Hermione, but... He trailed off, glancing away. His voice dropped. What would you have me do, Hermione? Insult him in his own home? Wage a war on him as well, with my diminished numbers? My mother brokered an alliance that has me marrying one of his daughters, or granddaughters. I've been pushing that off for some time now, and if I do anything else... You fear a reprisal, sighed Hermione, closing her eyes painfully. I understand that, Robb. I do. But am I not enough? Odds, you are. You are enough, he rushed out to say, making her eyes pop open in surprise. Hermione, please, don't think like that. His mouth slammed shut with an audible snap, and there was a panicked look in his eyes, which caused him to stop speaking immediately. He took a few moments to collect himself. Breathing in heavily, he then took a step outside the spell's barrier, shattering the privacy the spell afforded, and then said, Hermione, I understand where you are coming from, I really do. But, as King in the North, I cannot afford to slight Lord Frey. Your points are valid, and I respect them, but I am going to adhere to his wishes. While I think Lady Hermione makes a point, interjected Catelyn smoothly, glancing at them both as she had been reading their lips while separated from the rest of the crowd, I agree that we must observe the guest rights that Lord Frey is offering us, Robb. He is extending his honor, and we are duty-bound to respond. Fuck honor, thought Hermione darkly, watching as Robb and Catelyn began a low conversation about duty, honor, and the deal she brokered with Lord Frey, who was standing rather impatiently just underneath an overhang in the courtyard. What's going on? Asked Torrhen, quietly stepping up beside her. Frey wants me to leave my wand behind and Grey Wind to remain outside, she muttered back, eyes watching the three carefully. Torrhen frowned. That's not a good idea. You think something seems off here, too? Torrhen slowly nodded. I'll be on my guard, as long as you are. Hermione sighed. Yes, but without my wand. My wandless abilities aren't exactly amazing, you know, and while it seems that I am getting better, now isn't the time I want to test myself under stress. Can you fake your wand? Asked Torrhen instead. Hermione paused, and then a smile lit up her entire face. She exclaimed loudly, drawing attention to her. Oh, Torrhen, you're a genius! She brought her hands up and cupped his face, drawing him down and giving him a loud smacking kiss on both cheeks. Making a show of it, she slid her wand from her holster along with her last hair tie from the ponytail she had her hair up in. Let's see if I actually learned anything from the Weasley twins, she thought, and with a sleight of hand, non-verbally transfigured the hair tie into a passable copy of her wand, pressing it against Torrhen's chest in such a way that both lay flat. The fake wand was closest to Frey. Can you keep my magical wand safe for me, Torrhen? Perhaps you can give it to Darren? We all know how strong and honorable he is, especially since he's staying out here with the injured men to help them during this trying time, she loudly exclaimed, ensuring her voice carried. Tyrone, desperately wanting to roll his eyes at her overly fake act, forced out instead, Oh, yes. Of course, Lady Hermione, I am to serve. Merlin, don't overdo it, hissed Hermione, turning her body slightly so her shoulder blocked her other hand, sliding her wand into her jacket sleeve. Overdo it? Have you heard yourself? Hissed back Torrhen, but he plastered a bright smile on his face and stepped back, and then made a courtly bow. Loudly, he said, Oh, thank you, Lady Hermione. I will take care of your magic wand. He shot her a look and then turned on his heel, back towards a cluster of northern men at the far courtyard wall, including one very bewildered Darren Hornwood. Grey Wind, said Robb, eyes wide, flickering between her and the retreating figure of Torrhen with suspicion. Go with Karstark. The wolf whined loudly. Robb knelt in front of his wolf, wrapped his hands around his wolf's ears, and gave the thick fur along his neck a good scratch. I know, he murmured. It's only for now, I promise. I'll come visit soon. Grey Wind whined again, but gave his human a lick on the face, causing Robb to sputter out a laugh, and then turned and headed towards Torrhen. Robb then turned to face Walder Frey and asked, coolly, is this sufficient, my lord? The older man nodded and gestured for Robb to join him. Free bannermen opened the inner wall gate, and the two disappeared into the inner castle. A conversation between them on the logistics of the peace talk and summit they were going to host with the rest of the lords from the North and Riverlands. The conversation continued, and Hermione began to trail behind a bit with Caitlin, who was also frowning at the men. Is it just me, or does that mean exude creep? She muttered to the older woman. Like, it's my wand, I can do magic without it. But really, demanding things like that to someone who is supposed to be his king? Lord Frey is incredibly shrewd and dangerous, replied Catelyn darkly. But as much as I dislike it, I must agree with you, Lady Hermione. It is strange behavior. Oh, wonderful, replied Hermione with an eye roll. These talks are going to be a real blast then, aren't they? Be on your guard, instructed Catelyn, turning to face the woman just briefly as they entered the inner courtyard and walled the fence. And keep that wand hidden for as long as you can. We don't want to break guest rights. You saw that? Asked Hermione, only the tiniest bit guilty. Her safety, as well as Robb's and Torrhen's, meant she would have done anything to keep her wand with her. It was a smart precaution, said Catelyn instead. My ladies? A female Frey asked, coming up to them and giving a shallow curtsy. She was rather plain-looking, with an overbite that made Hermione wince in reminder of her own teeth before her 4th year. Your rooms are this way. They were led through a series of winding staircases that led up and up. There were only 10 rooms per floor, and with the many members of the Frey family, as well as dignitaries and guests from the North and Riverlands, they were brimming and at full capacity, leaving Hermione and Catelyn to share the Stark reserved floor at the highest level. Their rooms were next to one another, and Hermione gave the older woman a nod goodbye as she entered her room. The view out of the singular window was spectacular, even though the landscape was despairingly gray, wet, and overcast. There were 2 single beds in the room, and Hermione picked the nearest to the fireplace. She still hadn't become used to the damp weather the further north they had traveled, and it was beginning to seep into her bones. Eventually, Daisy joined her in the room, her eyes taking in all the nooks and crannies quickly with a practiced eye. Well, it's not Riverrun, she finally said, flopping down on the bed. How many did we lose? Asked Hermione, turning to her friend. Daisy sighed and stretched, leaving her feet and legs dangling off the side. A fair number, but your alarm brought attention to what was happening in the rear. Sooner than we'd have noticed. Surprised you brought the hound along, though. Why not? He helped me and tried to kill his brother, retorted Hermione, removing her beaded bag from her shoulder and placing it on the bed. Doesn't he deserve a chance? What's he done against you? All Cleganés are bad, Hermione, said Daisy quietly, anger thrumming in her voice.
Hermione shook her head.
I don't believe that. Like you believe that the Kingslayer can be saved. There was a sneer in her voice. Merlin above. Daisy, the man lost his hand. No one is paying his ransom or taking the offer to exchange him for Sansa, snapped Hermione. I think he's having a pretty damn difficult time of it, don't you? His entire world has been altered. Hermione let out a loud huff of air. Why do we keep arguing about this? It's fun to rile you up, replied the dark-haired Mormont, and she grinned, sitting up. Anyway, I overheard a few of the other lords on my way up. We've got a few days of rest before the summit begins. Doing what? Asked Hermione incredulously, looking around the small room. Daisy shrugged. But I did hear something interesting. Oh, there's going to be a feast first before the talks begin. The Mormont woman's grin turned devious. I hope you brought a nice dress in that bag of yours, Hermione. It was Hermione's turn to flop onto the bed face first. The bed cover failed to hide her groan. Despite their early arrival to the twins, it appeared that Walder Frey had everything ready for them, and as such, the feast was planned for the following evening, giving everyone from the Northern and Riverlands army time to rest in their rooms and then freshen up. Hermione wasn't particularly enamored with the idea of wearing a dress, but Daisy was insisting. "You wore dresses before," the tall Mormont said, frowning and wondering why her friend was being stubborn about it. "Why are you adverse to it now?" "Oh, I don't know," replied Hermione, rolling her eyes and turning her back on her friend. "Maybe it has something to do with drama, terror, and horror around every corner, and trousers are just easier to run and fight in." "Hear, hear," cheered Daisy darkly, saluting Hermione with a small cup of wine. They were in the assigned shared room and were missing the convenience of Hermione's tent. The fire was burning in their fireplace, and the two in true female form had taken over the space, with the beaded bag contents spilled out and over every imaginable surface in the room. Daisy had quickly chosen to wear her usual combat gear, but allowed Hermione to make a few stylistic changes in the color, so it was more festive in her words, and by adding the silk to her sleeves, attaching them to the leather cuffs she wore along her wrists. She was finishing up by pulling her hair into a braid, staring intently at her reflection with the pocket mirror Hermione carried, the one linked to Robb, Arya, and Sansa. Meanwhile, Hermione refashioned her periwinkle blue Yule Ball dress. It didn't fit on her anymore, but mixing the fabric and overlaying it with a few other items in her beaded bag meant she had a working dress, even if it was a mess. Daisy's pleasantly surprised and intrigued face said it all. A high mandarin collar from a repurposed sleeveless vest in shiny black silk merged into a tight pair of black leggings tucked into ankle boots. Over top her leggings, Hermione used the sheer periwinkle fabric, bleeding it from a black to silver ombre in the Stark colors, as a long ankle-length skirt. There were layers, so the black leggings weren't fully visible, but it was obvious enough that the fabric wasn't solid. There was an ethereal quality to the sleeveless dress that hugged her curves, even if the silky fabric of the skirt was full. It certainly was different to anything anyone in Westeros wore. Hermione affixed her wand holster on her right arm, the one that hid her wand. There was no way she was going to leave it behind, and even so, her magic would be called upon under extreme duress. She was always armed. "Is wearing your holster like that a good idea?" asked Daisy quietly, eyeing the leather. Hermione shrugged. "What else can I do? I don't feel comfortable walking around this place without it, but I don't have anywhere in this dress to hide it." "What about under your skirt? Like around the thigh?" asked Hermione for clarification, and together the two hoisted up the layered silk to bare her black leggings. Daisy kneeling in front of her, the other woman tapped the inside of Hermione's right thigh. "Here," she said, "we can use ribbon." "I can transfigure it instead," offered Hermione, removing her holster and transfiguring the ribbon Daisy held out into a belt-like strap. With Daisy's help, she wrapped it around his leg, high enough that the darker colored fabric of the skirt covered it. Hermione then hooked the holster into the strap and let the skirt fall. "Feels weird," she said, feeling the holster rub against her other thigh. "It'll do for tonight," said Daisy. "I've got some daggers. Can you use some spell on them? I've seen some looks from the Frey men that I'm not interested in pursuing further." Soon after, the two women left their room, Hermione taking the time to not only cast a disillusionment charm on Daisy's daggers, but also her beaded bag, which she shrunk and then tucked into the holster. By the time they got to the second bottom floor, several flights down, Hermione was fairly used to the odd sensation of her thigh holster. The hall was on the second floor of the inner castle, with a third floor overlooking it, partially from a balcony and catwalk, which led to the main lord's chambers. The hall itself was full, with several long tables lining up on either side, with a central aisle facing a raised dais, just under the balcony. Lord Walder Frey had a throne-like chair there. In front was a large free space for dancing. On entering, the Freys and their bannermen choked on their drinks when she and Daisy appeared, while the North and Riverlands men and lords were used to Hermione's eccentrics, in their opinion, anyway, so much so that her strange dress made them not bat their eyes. "Just grin," reminded Daisy through her teeth, and Hermione did just so. "It looks like His Grace left a space for you at the royal table." Whatever bitterness Daisy might once have held for Hermione had long since disappeared, but there was something still quietly disheartening in her friend's voice that made Hermione turn to her in question. The other woman just flattened her lips and shook her head. Her eyes were sad, though, despite her encouraging tone when she said, "Go, just go, I'll speak to you later." Hermione, frowning, set off towards the first table nearest the raised dais on the right where Robb spotted her. He stood, his deep blue eyes swept her from head to toe, and there was a grin on his face when she approached. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, greeting her with a kiss on the back of her hand. He helped her into her seat and then took his on her right. On her other side was Catelyn, who had a sour look on her face, one that eased as she sighed. On Hermione's other side was Lord Bolton, and then Umber, Karstark, and Glover. Bracken and Blackwood were 2 tables behind. Walder Frey stood, and in his gravelly voice, gave speeches. He pushed a few flat jokes about Robb's upcoming marriage to one of his daughters, or granddaughters, or great-granddaughters, as a threat and reminder of the promise Catelyn made. It didn't endear him to anyone in the room, but those in the room quickly attention turned to their stomach, as the food was brought out from a convenient side door underneath and off to the side of the balcony. Platter after platter of suckling pig, roasts, potatoes, reeds and vegetables, chicken and quail, any heavenly creamy soups and broths were presented, their delicious scents wafting across the tables and making Hermione's stomach rumble loudly. Arbor Gold wine from the Reach was poured, and then the musicians began playing. A conversation began among those at the tables, and soon, as more and more alcohol was poured, the laughter and conversation grew louder and louder. Freys were laughing and joking with the Great John, and Karstark seemed to be in the middle of a debate with Blackwood and Bracken. Black Walder Frey was at his father's side, whispering in his ear, while Catelyn and her uncle, the Blackfish, were watching as several more serving girls back a circuit of the room, always passing in front of Robb like they were being shown off. Hermione tapped the toe of her boot to the beat as Daisy threw herself into the crowd, catching the first man she came across and moved him onto the floor with her as her partner. Others joined her, and soon the floor was crowded. Torrhen was the first to encourage her to join him on the floor, and knowing that her friend was just as poorly suited to the task of dancing as she was, Hermione laughingly agreed. Together they spun around the floor in the exuberant reels that the North favored. After the song, Lord Karstark took her as his partner, and then Bracken and Blackwood. Lucas Blackwood blushed a furious red when he asked her, but she agreed, and then she breathlessly decided to sit a few out to catch her breath, a grin splitting her cheeks. Several songs later, a voice interrupted her conversation with Torrhen. "My lady?" Hermione looked up, seeing Robb standing before her. He extended his hand, and Hermione, glancing between it and his face, and blushed furiously and shook her head. "Oh no. Honestly, Robb, I couldn't... I don't know the steps." "It didn't stop you earlier, Lady Hermione," he grinned, wiggling his fingers. "Come on, give it a try. I promise I won't lead you anywhere. You don't want to go." There was something strange in his tone, thought Hermione, eyeing him, softness to his face that Hermione had been seeing more and more often. "Oh, just go," muttered Torrhen from her side, an amused smile on his face. He shoved her ankle under the table with his foot. Hermione glanced back at Robb. It was that softness that prompted her to stand, not Torrhen. Instead, her friend Cat called over the strings, and the brass of the musicians on the balcony overlooking the Great Hall, and Hermione resolutely ignored it even if her cheeks blushed. Robb's hand was warm in hers, and he gently pulled her close, placing her hand in the crook of his elbow as he led her between other dancing partners, somewhere in the middle of the crowd. Around her were men and women, Frey, Stark, Karstark, Umber, Mormont, Glover, Bolton, Ryger, Blackwood, and more, bowing and curtsying. There was a moment of breathless anticipation, and then they were moving. The strings on the strange mandolin-style instrument echoed in the room, and the beat, while not quick, was fast enough that there was some immediate, intricate footwork. Hermione kept her eyes on Robb's feet, glancing at Daisy every few steps. She eased by Robb, following him with her chin over her shoulder as he mimicked her, his steps with a bit more flair and a twist for his wrist. Daisy, who was nearby, had her head thrown back, barking out a loud laugh and wide smile on her face, as her partner, Eddard Karstark, grinned. Hermione felt her heart swell with happiness. It wasn't a waltz, a simple 1, 2, 3, 4, but there were crisscrossing steps, and Hermione nearly stumbled, but then Robb moved forward and caught her arm, and suddenly they were twirling like an energetic reel, and Hermione was startled enough that she laughed out loud. Her eyes caught Robb's, and he grinned. His cheeks were flushed, and the grin on his face made him seem years younger. The weight of being a king was off his shoulders, and there, at that moment, he was just another young man dancing, spinning. Quicker and quicker, he led her through the other partners and weaving their arms under and then over the other couples as they moved through the archways that they made until they were at the end of the line nearest to where Lord Frey sat, glowering over the entire hall. Then he spun her sharply, and they were the ones moving under the arm tunnel. And back to the side steps, a dance within a dance, as they were always off to the side of one another. Never chest to chest, until Robb swept Hermione back into his arms, close enough that she felt his breath on her face. He was looking down at her, his eyes focused and tracing her features, the light dusting of freckles on her nose, her amber eyes, and she was sure something was going to happen right then and there, in Frey's Great Hall, when his eyes dropped to look at her lips. Then they were spinning again, around and around, and the room blurred past her, but all Hermione could see was Robb, holding her steady, and his blue eyes so focused on hers, the colors and sounds of the room faded away, and it was just them, moving around and around, eyes only on one another, until the music came to a startling end, and they stopped, breathing heavily, and just looking at each other. The crowd laughed, loudly cheering, and Hermione sucked in a deep breath of air, carefully stepping back and away from Robb. As she did so, she dropped her eyes and watched as her arms slid from his grasp, until his fingers were left just clutching, dangling on her fingertips, a last connection, a last breathless moment of something that happened between them. But she stepped back once more and laughed nervously, fanning herself. "I think I need a drink." And as she moved between couples and others still on the dance floor, she felt the hard stare of his eyes on her back, but didn't turn around. She couldn't, not only because of where they were, but because of who they were. He was a king, promised to marry one of Lord Frey's many children, or grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, and she was the witch from another world who just wanted to go home. Didn't she? She ended up next to Torrhen, who had been sitting at the guest of honor table set up for Robb and his chosen entourage of lords, as well as Hermione and her guard. Sober, Torrhen quirked Hermione a small smile, pushed a goblet towards her across the table, and silently topped it off with arbor gold. He didn't need to say anything. He knew he had seen a lot over those months, the past year, and Hermione took a deep gulp of the wine to hide her eyes. Eventually, Robb returned to the table, as did Daisy and a few others. Robb ended up in discussion with Lord Ryger and a Kingsguard member, Lucas Blackwood, and Hermione felt the weight of his eyes as they constantly flicked over to her. Off near the one end, Karstark, the Greatjon, and Bracken were in a discussion of something heated, their faces flushed with wine and ale, and the Greatjon slammed his fist on the table, making their nearby dishes rattle. Catelyn, who was one free seat over with her uncle, the Blackfish, shot them a nasty glare. Hermione, nursing her third drink of that evening, the one Torrhen poured her, glanced over as Catelyn heaved a sigh. "Don't you drink, Lord Glover?" she asked, turning back to the man she was conversing with before the Greatjon's emphatic interruption. Lord Glover's eyes gleamed in the dark, and he smiled thinly. "Never do, my lady. It dulls the senses." The Blackfish looked at him incredulously. "That's the point. Anyway, my lord, are ready you to return home? Once this silly summit of peace talks, or whatever it is we're calling it, is over, His Majesty will have us moving back north to retake Winterfell and clear those sons of whores once and for all." "It would make me very happy," replied the man, dipping his head slightly. "I do look forward to things." Catelyn looked at him oddly, but the Blackfish belched beside her, and she grimaced. "Pardon, my lord, my lady, but I need to find a tree to piss on." Catelyn waved him away with a disgusted look on her face, and he stood, Lord Glover standing with him. "I'll make sure he finds his way," he told Catelyn wryly, and disappeared with the large Tully. Now, sitting by herself, Hermione wondered if she should move over, talk to the woman on her first excursion out of Riverrun, after Robb's imprisonment of her for her actions. With Jaime back in their grasp, everything she did was for nothing, even before the discovery of Arya's location and Bran and Rickon's survival. However, solitary confinement, her father's death, and Arya's return had helped straighten some of Catelyn's muddled thoughts. Enough, anyway, for her to join them on the diplomatic summit at the Twins, given that she originally brokered the deal. The moment she made her mind up, rising from the long bench, Hermione heard the music change from the upbeat reels to something more somber. The string, something similar to a violin, began to play. The door at the far end of the hall, leading out towards the bridge, was shut by two Frey bannermen. "Your Grace," called out Walder Frey, his reedy voice rising across the slow, haunting melody. quickly silencing the room while the music, a single verse of some sort, looped. Robb stood and turned to face the man on his dais, as Ryger and Lucas stepped back from him respectfully. I feel that I've been remiss in my duties. I've given you meats, wine, and music, but I haven't shown you the hospitality you deserve. He finished with a thin chuckle. Quickly, the voices died down at the slow draw of the string as it slowly built. Hermione glanced around, pausing. The heavy, tense air that suddenly appeared had her heart begin to beat quickly, and at her side, Torring had bolted to his feet, eyes wide. Catelyn, further down, was staring at Lord Glover, who had returned from showing the blackfish out, but—
"Why is he in chainmail?"
wondered Hermione, eyes narrowing. Something's not right here. We were supposed to leave all weapons at the door. Robb stood apart, his Kingsguard scattered around the room, some like Darren Hornwood, too drunk even to stand, as they tried to understand the change in the atmosphere. Daisy, the nearest, had a perplexed look on her face. Torring shoved away from the table, pushing so hard that the goblets rattled and several fell over, as he roared, "Your Grace, move! Lady Hermione!" Hermione turned and found herself face to face with Lord Glover, the thin man impassively staring down at her, a queer look in his eyes. Her eyes darted down at the dagger in his hand. Oh fuck. Her mind supplied, and then everything sped up in disjointed bursts of images and flickering torchlight, all overlaid with the same haunting melody. Someone screamed, and Hermione lurched back into the table as it dug into the small of her back, just as Glover lunged forward, his gloved hand grabbing her collar. He raised his arm over his head to swing the dagger down, but Hermione grabbed his gloved hand and with her left and swung her right arm up to brace her forearm with her hand against the man's chest. The impact jarred her. She shoved forward with her weight braced against the older, taller man, shouting in the racket, "Expulso!" and watched as he flew backward, slamming into the wall behind them and sliding down, unconscious. However, in the time she was dealing with Glover, a battle had erupted inside the hole. Torrin was at her side, twisting her around to look her over quickly, and then placed himself between her and the rest of the room, unarmed. A Frey soldier ran at him, sword already bathed, red in someone's blood. Torrin reached back for one of the pewter plates and sent it flying at the man like a frisbee. Hermione used the man's distraction, ripping the front of her skirt to expose the black leggings underneath. She grabbed her wand from her holster, raising her arm. She snapped out, Defendo, watching as the vicious blue light sliced the man's throat. He dropped to the floor. Torrin raced forward and took the man's sword, and then joined the melee, Hermione at his side. Robb was somewhere in the mess, and she needed to find him. Dimly, she was aware that the music had stopped, and another noise had overtaken the hall, that of screams and roars of pain. But it wasn't just coming from inside the great hall. Horror overtook her, and she glanced at the high open windows that faced towards the inner courtyard. "They're attacking us outside, too." She went to move around Torrin, but slid on some warm, fresh blood and fell to her knees. "Shit," she screeched, scrambling in the warm liquid as she struggled to rise. The face of a somewhat familiar Stark bannerman, eyes wide open, mouth slack, greeted her. Hermione swallowed back rising bile and looked up, determination in her every feature. Someone roared, "The Great John!" Her mind supplied, and then, without realizing it, she was back at Hogwarts during the final battle. Spells flew from her wand, a repeated litany, Defendo, Expulso, Reducto, Sectum Sempra. Blood splattered across her face, staining her ombre silks, blood on her knees and legs from where she had slipped and skidded in it, previously caked and hardened to the point that her leggings were soaked and stiff. Torring was beside her, slashing his own way through the men, trying to get to Robb, to Daisy, to Darren, or Lucas, or Eddard, or anyone else he could see struggling without weapons. The blood that coated him coated her, and she wasn't sure if it was hers or his or someone else's anymore. A Frey guard came up from Hermione's unguarded left, while her face was turned right. Torrin lunged across her vision, physically throwing himself at the Frey, and both collapsed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, grappling for the fallen swords. In between, they punched and clawed, and Hermione couldn't get a clear line to the man to cast. Just as she was about to summon Torrin to yank him off the man, Torrin gasped and paused. Hermione's heart stopped. "Torrin," she whispered. Then he stood shakily. The Frey was dead, his neck at an odd angle. Hermione breathed in relief, watching carefully as Torrin listed a bit to the side. Toreen, she asked again. Are you all right? The tall Stark turned and nodded his head, his face almost painted red. Only parts of his forehead and his chin were clear. The entire right side of his face was red, and his left had numerous splatter marks. He looked like an avenging god. Let's go. Hermione nodded and slashed her wand viciously as she neared Frey, one of the Lord's many sons, and watched as the spell went through his leathers, through his skin, and deeply gouged a line as he was cut from hip to shoulder, a diagonal mimicry of Dolohov's own scar on her torso. He fell, and then Robb was there. They had managed to cross the frenzied floor, but he was staggering to his feet, eyes wide and mouth pressed tight in a pained line. There was an arrow in his shoulder. The other one her mind supplied, thinking back to the injury she healed at the crag, high enough that it wasn't fatal, but it was dangerous enough that it pierced through his tunic and vest. The king in the north arises, mocked Walder Frey, but Hermione had no time for him, slipping on the stone and tripping over a body. The twang and snap of another arrow being released caught her attention over the noise in the hall, and another arrow slammed into Robb, lower this time, but still near his shoulder, and he stumbled back. They were aiming to keep him unstable and incapable of fighting. She caught herself on the back of a chair, hunched over, and lurched closer to Robb. He looked up from the second arrow, saw her, and groaned quietly, Hermione, but she heard him all the same over all the other noise. Somewhere, distantly, Hermione heard Catelyn shouting, Lord Walder! Lord Walder! Enough! Let it end! Please! He is my son, my first son! And the man reply. But, just as she was within feet of Robb, a shadowy figure behind him caught her eye. Robb, behind you, she shouted, but her voice was lost. His pained eyes frowned at her, but at her panic he turned, and there was Glover, nursing a nasty-looking head wound, but still moving forward, his dagger out, and then it flashed forward, and Robb hunched over. She could hear the man clearly, as his voice had a sonorous specifically made for her ears. The Lannisters send their regards, and Hermione screamed. Someone else was screaming too, but her eyes were on the redhead as he staggered back, away from Glover with wide eyes and his hands pressed at his stomach. Then Hermione was clutching at Robb and turning him to face her as they both sunk to their knees in the middle of the chaos. His eyes were cloudy, and there was a line of blood around his lips, and his face was pale, but it was lined with anger and pain. Hermione, he gasped, shuddering, do it, please. One shaking hand reached up from pressing against his wound, and he touched the silver direwolf, commissioned so long ago now, on his jacket's overflap. Hermione nodded shakily, and Robb sank in on himself, struggling to breathe. They were no longer touching. Hermione had her wand in one bloody hand, pointed at her own direwolf pin on her collar. Their eyes met, and as they held, she whispered, Gryffindor. His eyes were the last thing she saw before there was a violent hook in her navel and a nauseating swirl of colors as the world blurred around them. The portkey deposited Hermione in a jumble of limbs in the snow. She landed hard on the cold, freezing ground. What the blades of grass that popped up through the snow were brushed white with frost. The painful landing stole the breath from her, and she groaned. Her entire body was aching, and she was covered in cuts and bruises and splattered with blood, some of it her own. Her head dizzy from the jarring portkey trip, her magic being pulled in too many directions, as the password phrase word yanked at not only her portkey, but everyone else's at the twins, leaving only the dead behind. The clearing she was in was the one Robb had chosen so long ago, the large space in the Wolf's Wood that Ned Stark showed him and Jon when they were younger. There were large trees dotting the area, however, and the few who had portkeyed in had unfortunately fallen into the thick trunks, either groaning with pain or dead on impact. The leaning tower loomed over them. A groan beside her had Hermione rolling onto her side and then kneeling, crawling towards Torren, who lay sprawled on his back, his face pale and eyes closed. Around them there were shouts of Maester, Medic, as well as the moans and cries of others who were unused to the portkey travel. Hermione could hear someone weeping, another screaming out, as well as the great Jon's loud, rumbling voice shouting, Numbers, numbers, where are our men? Form up. Torren whispered Hermione, coming to his side. Lady, Hermione, he gasped, opening his eyes. They were glassy and bright, and he grimaced as he tried to move. Hermione's eyes moved down her friend's face, beyond the blood splatter on his cheeks and forehead, and the large amount on his leathers and chest plate, both stained a deep, rusty red. Her eyes stopped, however, at Torrhen's lower stomach, where his hands were clasped tightly, pressing down. "Torrhen?" cried Hermione, shooing away his hands, only to see blood bubble up and seep through a large wound that stretched under his plate armor at his waist. She gagged at the sight of squishy innards. A flesh wound, milady," the Karstark gasped. A sob that masked as a laugh burst from Hermione's mouth. "No, you're right, a flesh wound," she said, tears welling in her eyes. Hermione scrambled for her beaded bag from under her skirt, reaching in and wordlessly summoning Essence of Dittany. "Nothing a little potion can't fix, Torrhen." "Idardud, Torrhen." Lord Karstark's voice boomed through the night, but Hermione paid no mind. She poured the potion directly onto Torrhen's wound, but it did little. Hissing where it touched hot blood, Torrhen grit his teeth, but a mangled shout still burst from his lips, and Hermione watched in growing frustration and horror that only the internal bleeding around his intestines had stopped, but the wound did not seal. "Come on, please," whispered Hermione frantically, summoning a blood-replenishing potion from her beaded bag. She pointed her wand at Torrhen and tried Snape's counterspell to Sectum Sempra, hoping it would work. "Vulnerus Sanintor." "Please, Torrhen, Merlin, please." "Lady Hermione." Across from her, a bloodied Eddard Karstark skidded to a halt, crashing to his knees. His wide eyes stared at his brother, and he reached forward, grasping his brother's hand. His head turned, and he shouted, "Father, here." Rickard Karstark appeared shortly, watching Hermione as she tried spell after spell. "Lady Hermione, please, please tell me." "I'm trying," she cried, tears spilling over onto her cheeks. She angrily wiped them away with the back of a bloody hand, leaving a bloody streak, and tipped more Essence of Dittany into the wound. But the potion just pooled, and then bubbled over across Torrhen's lower stomach, onto the frozen ground beneath him. That ground was slowly staining red. "Lady Hermione," gasped Torrhen. "Shh, Tor! Don't speak!" muttered Karstark tearily. Somewhere behind them, Hermione could hear Greatjon shouting, "Where's the king? Where's Lady Stark?" Torrhen's eyes, growing hazy, lazily slid to his father and brother on his other side. "Father. Dead." He gave them a watery smile. He coughed and his body shuddered. More blood poured from his wound, and Hermione swore loudly and furiously. A grin tugged at Torrhen's lips as he heard it. "My niece, okay." "No," burst Hermione, the word catching on a sob. She fell back on her heels, kneeling at his side and grabbing his other hand. "No, it's not okay, Torrhen." "I did my duty," he gasped, eyes back on her. His body shook with tremors. "For King Robb. For you, Lady Hermione." He gave a tiny smile at the sobbing witch at his side. "I'd do it, gain." Hermione wordlessly shook her head, blinking rapidly to dislodge the tears that were making Torrhen's face blurry. "So glad," he gasped, his voice growing fainter. "To have met you." His eyelids began to flutter. Then he exhaled, his body growing still. Rickard Karstark's face paled to snow white, and he reached forward, gathering Torrhen's upper body to him to rest in his lap. He began to rock back and forth, crying loudly, "My boy." Hermione shuddered. A long time ago, another man cried the same thing. Clutching his own dead son, on a quiet night, just as the Triwizard Tournament ended, for Hermione it was the beginning of 4 years of horror. Next to his father, Eddard gave a shuddering gasp and curled in on himself. Hermione, however, just sat there, clutching Torrhen's limp hand and staring vacantly at her friend's slack face. Then she was lifted to her feet, 2 large hands clutching at her and shaking her. Her eyes jerked from Torrhen's body. Just as Eddard leaped to his feet, sword at his side, staring at the man who had her dangling off the ground in front of him. He was shouting something in her face, and she tried to focus. "Lady Hermione, where's the king?" He must have shouted at her a few times. Hermione blinked, and her eyes refocused on the large man, the Greatjon's angry brown eyes burning into her. Eddard was on his feet, shouting up at him, "Stop it, Umber! Stop it! Can't you see she's in shock?" Hermione swallowed, and the Greatjon reluctantly let her down, asking again, this time less loud but just as frantic, "Where's Robb, Hermione?" Hermione's mouth dropped open and she twisted her head as best she could in Greatjon's arms, and her eyes raked across the men, picking out several she knew and other bannermen she didn't. There were the Karstarks, and Rose Bolton was dazedly walking towards them in an uneven line, his face paler than normal, and a line of blood still weeping from his temple. Greatjon was in front of her, and Darren was screaming himself hoarse, clutching his arm with one hand where there was a stump from above his elbow. Blackwood and Bracken were working together to help carry someone between them. Where is he? Where's Robb? She thought, her heart beating frantically as she spun on her heel, looking for the familiar deep red of his hair, the gray of his tunic trimmed with white, his bright blue eyes. Grey Wind, she found after a moment, limping badly from a long, bleeding cut on his back leg and snarling at anyone who got too close, covered in blood and grime, arrows sticking out of his flank. Robb was not near Grey Wind, nor was he anywhere else. Hermione stressed Greatjon, his own eyes wide as she turned back to him. Where's Robb? Her heart plummeted to the ground as she realized she didn't know where he was. Robb Stark was not with them. The portkey was as nauseating as Robb knew it would be, but it was nothing compared to the agony of the stab wound Glover had inflicted on him, and Robb's hand pushed futilely at it. He tried to stem the bleeding, even as he tried to catch his breath, yet he only managed to gasp and wheeze. So he lay there, staring up at the trees, wondering why they looked so strange. He was in the Wolf's Wood, was he not? Just as he and Hermione had planned with their emergency portkeys. But something was wrong. Something was very wrong. His eyelids began to droop, and black spots crept across his vision as he cooled. So this is where I will die, he thought, sluggishly. Distantly, he could hear something, someone trampling through bushes and on twigs and branches. A light bobbed ahead, and he turned his head to focus on it. Squinting, something came close, breaking a nearby branch on the ground, but it was on Robb's other side, and he no longer had the strength to turn his head. Then there was a snort and a warm puff of air, and something wet brushed his cheek. There was a lick on his cheek with a rough tongue. He smiled. Grey Wind. But just as he slipped into unconsciousness, he heard a strangely accented voice say, "Ear! Over ear, Professor! Back, Fang, back!" And then he knew no more.